Back in 2002, 19 million people tuned in live for a Stephen King miniseries. To put that in perspective, that's more viewers than the series finale of Breaking Bad got. 19 million people collectively experiencing the same haunted house story at the same time. So, why is it that hardly anybody talks about it today? Why isn't Rose Red remembered like It, The Shining, or even the completely deranged Maximum Overdrive? Today, we're diving into the bizarre history of Rose Red, a sprawling haunted house epic that should have been one of King's most memorable adaptations. We'll unpack its strange origins as a failed Spielberg collaboration, how King's near-fatal accident shaped its creation, its deep connections to America's most famous haunted houses, and why the biggest haunted house story King ever told ultimately faded from our collective memory like a ghost. The 90s had already established King as television horror royalty with massive miniseries events like It in 1990, The Stand in 1994, and even his own remake of The Shining in 1997. Which, let's be honest, was basically King saying, "Dear Stanley Kubrick, I'd like to try this again, thank you very much." Before prestige streaming services changed how we consume TV, networks treated King adaptations like blockbuster events. They were appointment television, multi-night spectacles that dominated ratings and water cooler conversations. And King, for his part, seemed to prefer television for his more sprawling stories. The longer format gave breathing room for his elaborate character work and supernatural mythologies that often got butchered in 2-hour theatrical cuts. But on the cusp of a new millennium, King's career took an unexpected and nearly tragic turn. On June 19, 1999, King was walking along the shoulder of Route 5 in Maine when a distracted driver in a minivan struck him. The impact was devastating. A collapsed right lung, multiple fractures to his hip and leg, and a head wound that would require multiple surgeries. King himself would later say, "I was on the way to the dead." His recovery was grueling. Confined to a hospital bed, then a wheelchair, then learning to walk again with a cane, King was facing not just physical pain, but a creative crisis. Would he ever write again? And if so, what? During this period, King turned to a project that had been brewing before the accident, a haunted house story that would eventually become Rose Red. Writing became his escape, his distraction from the pain, and in a strange way, his brush with mortality infused this ghost story with something deeper, a meditation on life, death, and what might exist in between. But here's where things get interesting. Rose Red wasn't originally conceived as a Stephen King original. It started as something else entirely, a collaboration between two of the biggest names in entertainment. Imagine this alternate timeline. It's the mid-1990s. Steven Spielberg, fresh off of Jurassic Park and Schindler's List, teams up with Stephen King to remake one of the greatest haunted house stories ever written, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. This wasn't just some Hollywood rumor, it was actually happening. Spielberg was set to direct, King would write the screenplay, and together they'd modernize Jackson's psychological masterpiece for a new generation. But there was just one small problem. They fundamentally disagreed on what makes a haunted house story work. Spielberg, ever the optimist, wanted an uplifting ending, something that would leave audiences with hope after all the scares. King, well, if you've read literally any Stephen King book, you know that's not exactly his style. King wanted more psychological darkness, ambiguity, and the kind of ending that makes you check your closet before bed. These creative differences ultimately killed what could have been the horror collaboration of the decade.
Steven Spielberg came to me back, I think, in 1996 and said, "I'd like to make the scariest haunted house movie ever. Would you write it?"
Spielberg went on to produce DreamWorks' The Haunting in 1999, directed by Jan de Bont, a CGI-heavy remake that critics savaged and audiences quickly forgot. Catherine Zeta-Jones and Owen Wilson probably deserved better. And so did we. But King wasn't ready to abandon the haunted house. Instead, he took the basic DNA of that failed collaboration and decided to create his own sprawling haunted mansion epic. Where The Haunting favored suggestion and ambiguity, King went maximalist. Visible ghosts everywhere, weird psychic powers, and a mythology so complex it required its own fictional historical records. Rose Red was born, not as a remake of Jackson's subtle masterpiece, but as King's answer to it. And to understand what made Rose Red so unique, we need to look at the 3 major haunted houses that influenced its creation. If you've seen Rose Red, you know the house itself is the true main character, a sprawling, ever-changing mansion that seems to have a mind of its own. This wasn't just King being King. Rose Red draws heavily from America's most famous real-life haunted mansion, the Winchester Mystery House. Located in San Jose, California, the Winchester House was built by Sarah Winchester, widow of the Winchester rifle magnate. After losing both her husband and infant daughter, the story goes that Sarah consulted a medium who told her she was cursed by the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, and the only way to appease them? Never stop building this house. As the story goes, for the next 38 years, until her death in 1922, construction never ceased. The result is architectural madness. 160 rooms, staircases that lead to ceilings, doors that open to brick walls, and windows overlooking other rooms. It's a labyrinth designed to confuse vengeful spirits, a physical manifestation of grief and guilt. Sound familiar? Rose Red borrows heavily from this concept. The idea of a house that never stops growing, that changes its floor plan overnight, that seems to feed on tragedy and expand with each new death. Ellen Rimbauer's compulsion to build mirrors Sarah Winchester's, both women driven by supernatural forces they barely understand. But Rose Red isn't just inspired by real-world architecture. Its literary DNA comes straight from Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, the very book King and Spielberg initially wanted to adapt. Jackson's novel, published in 1959, revolutionized haunted house fiction with its psychological approach. Hill House isn't just haunted, it's wrong. As Jackson famously wrote, Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. What makes Jackson's work so influential is its ambiguity. Are the hauntings real or manifestations of Eleanor's fragile psychology? Is Hill House feeding on her vulnerability, or is she simply breaking under the weight of her own trauma? King, for his part, clearly admired this approach, but being Stephen King, he couldn't help but make it bigger, louder, and more explicit. Rose Red keeps Jackson's idea of a house that's alive and hunting, but amplifies it with King's trademark psychic abilities and visible supernatural phenomena. And speaking of psychic abilities, we can't ignore the obvious connection to King's most famous haunted building story, The Shining. Rose Red works almost as a companion piece to The Shining. Both feature buildings that are predatory, sentient forces. Both center around psychic abilities, The Shine in The Shining and Annie Wheaton's telekinetic powers in Rose Red. Both show how these buildings isolate and prey upon their inhabitants, turning them against each other. But where the Overlook Hotel in The Shining is a pressure cooker, confined, claustrophobic, and isolating, Rose Red is a sprawling maze, constantly expanding, swallowing its victims into its endless corridors. It's as if King took the concept of the Overlook and stretched it to its logical extreme. With these inspirations in mind, ABC was ready to turn King's haunted house vision into the television event of 2002. If you weren't watching TV in January 2002, it was almost impossible to escape the marketing blitz for Rose Red. ABC promoted this as must-see horror television, premiering across 3 consecutive nights like a horror marathon event. This wasn't just another TV movie. This was a $35 million production. Essentially a television blockbuster at a time when that kind of budget for TV was almost unheard of. For context, a typical episode of Friends in that era cost about $2 million. Rose Red had Hollywood production values and the Stephen King name attached.
I love ABC. They've been very good to me. And I've been good to them.
Speaking of King, he wasn't just lending his name. He wrote each installment himself, which ABC heavily promoted. From the Mind of Stephen King was plastered across every commercial break, with the not-so-subtle implication that this would be the next It. And initially, it worked spectacularly. 19 million viewers tuned in for the first night, numbers that network executives today would sacrifice their firstborn kid for. But ABC didn't stop with just the miniseries itself. They created an entire Rose Red universe, a marketing strategy that feels almost ahead of its time. There was a novel tie-in called The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer, supposedly the found journal of the house's original mistress. ABC even produced a mockumentary about the fictional Rose Red mansion, presented as if it were a real historical location. This was basically an early attempt at a Marvel-style expanded universe, but for a haunted house. It was transmedia storytelling before that term was even widely used. It essentially took the foundation built by the Blair Witch Project a few years earlier and just ran with it. So, with all this success, all this promotion, all this audience engagement, why did Rose Red fade from our cultural memory? Why isn't it mentioned alongside King classics like It or The Stand? To answer that, we need to look at both when Rose Red aired and what was happening in television at that moment. Rose Red premiered at a pivotal moment in television history. The Sopranos was 3 seasons in, fundamentally changing what TV drama could be. Within a year of that, shows like The Wire would debut. The era of prestige television was dawning, and audience expectations were shifting rapidly. Rose Red, for all its ambition, still felt like a 90s network melodrama. Big performances, obvious music cues, and a certain theatrical quality that was quickly becoming outdated. It was a film caught between eras. Too late for the golden age of the network miniseries, too early for the prestige horror renaissance that would later give us shows like The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix. Then there's the format problem. And over 4 hours long, Rose Red demands a significant time commitment. When it aired live across 3 nights, that commitment felt like an event. But for later viewing, that's a tough sell, especially with pacing issues that become more apparent when you're not watching with commercial breaks and 24 hours between episodes. The miniseries suffers from what we might call middle episode syndrome. A strong opening, a memorable finale, and a whole lot of wheel spinning in between. There are simply too many characters, too many subplots, and too many scenes of people wandering dark hallways saying, "Hello? Is anyone there?" And let's talk about those ghosts. Where Shirley Jackson's Hill House thrived on suggestion and ambiguity, Rose Red goes all in with the visible apparitions, psychic battles, and early 2000s CGI that, well, let's just say it hasn't aged like fine wine. This maximalist approach was fun for viewers at the time, but it lacks the staying power of more subtle horror. When everything is visible, everything explained, and everything is cranked to 11, there's no room left for the imagination. A place where true horror thrives. Finally, Rose Red suffers from what I call the curse of the TV miniseries. Like King's other television epics, Storm of the Century, The Langoliers, Desperation, these massive initial airings often failed to translate into lasting cultural touchstones. They weren't replayable in the way theatrical films were. They rarely got proper home video releases, and they existed in a strange limbo. Too long for a movie night, not episodic enough for a traditional TV viewing. Rose Red essentially became a ghost of itself, remembered vaguely by those who saw it, but fading a little more with each passing year. Despite fading from mainstream memory, Rose Red has maintained a cult following over the years. Some fans rewatch it for nostalgia. Others appreciate it as one of King's most ambitious haunted house stories. The house design itself stands out amongst King's creations, a character in its own right with a rich mythology and visual identity. The idea of a house that grows and changes, that hunts and consumes, remains compelling even when some of the execution feels pretty dated. For King scholars, Rose Red holds a special place as one of his most direct engagements with the haunted house subgenre. It's fascinating to see how he takes inspiration from Shirley Jackson while putting his own unmistakable stamp on the material. The connections to The Shining make it an interesting, alternate haunted house story, as if King is revisiting similar themes but with a slightly different approach. Watching Rose Red today feels like opening a time capsule of early 2000s television. The earnest performances, the deliberate pacing, the special effects that were cutting edge for TV at the time. It's a snapshot of event television just before streaming changed everything. It's also a reminder of a time when millions of Americans would simultaneously experience the same story, creating a shared cultural moment that's increasingly rare in our fragmented media landscape. 19 million people all watching the same ghost story. That's just something that doesn't really happen anymore. So yeah, those 19 million people watched Rose Red live, and then it vanished. But maybe that's part of what makes it interesting. It's Stephen King at a crossroads, facing mortality after his accident, still obsessed with America's haunted house mythology and going full maximalist just before horror got whispered and subtle again. Rose Red is not a forgotten failure. It's an artifact. It captures both King and TV horror in transition. Oversized, melodramatic, ambitious, and in its own way, kind of unforgettable if you revisit it today. It's the haunted house that America collectively visited for 3 nights in 2002, then seemingly agreed never to speak of again. But like all good ghost stories, it lingers in the corners of our cultural memory, waiting for someone to open the door and invite it back in. Besides, any haunted house with endless doors to nowhere automatically gets extra points. Take that, house hunters. If you've seen Rose Red, let me know your memories in the comments. And if you haven't, maybe it's time to pay this forgotten mansion a visit. Just don't blame me if you get lost in the hallways. Looking to perform another cinematic postmortem on a classic film? Then be sure to check out my video on the house that Jack built. There's a link here on the screen. I hope to see you over there.